This is a recording from a Sunday meeting of the BC Humanists Association in Vancouver. The opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect those of the BCHA or its board of directors. To learn more about humanism and to support our work, visit bchumanists.ca, and make sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and be sure to subscribe to the BC Humanists podcast.
Today we have Dale Beyerstein and Lee Mahler, and they're going to be talking about skeptics then and now. We have the two of them today, and they're going to sort of tag team it. And welcome our speakers, Dale and Lee.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction. This kind of looks like Old Home Week for me, given the talk about the origins of the BC Skeptics and the modern skeptical movement, because there are several people here today who were there at the very first meeting of the BC Skeptics. Bill Henry, who later moved to Winnipeg and founded the Manitoba Skeptics. Lee Mahler, again. Frank, I can't remember whether you were at the first meeting or not.
I don't remember.
It came about because we got a list of subscribers to the Skeptical Inquirer, and Frank was a subscriber, but I can't remember if he showed up at the meeting. And Conrad Hadlin, were you at were you at that first meeting?
No, I wasn't.
But shortly after. Yeah. So this really is kind of Old Home Week for the BC Skeptics. But I wanted to begin going back in history a little bit farther than that, a few 10 or so years before that, to the origins of the sort of the big organization that turned skepticism around in the mid-70s, the organization SciComm, as it then was, and it's now called CSI, the Committee for the Scientific Investigation of the Claims of the Paranormal, grew out of the humanist movement. Paul Kurtz, who is professor of philosophy at State University of New York at Buffalo, a philosopher, which makes me feel good because I fancy myself as almost one too, was the president of the American Humanist Association in the mid-70s. And in 1976, he thought that the paranormal was, at that time, really getting out of control, and that it was time for humanists and academics to do their bit to try to turn the tide. And history will tell us whether how successful they were at that. Look in your newspaper, you still see the horoscopes. Look on any day of the week on the television and see how many programs there really take a skeptical point of view. But at least we can say that it probably kept the tide from coming in any further than it has. But anyway, in 1976, Paul Kurtz wanted to have a statement in the Humanist magazine, which was the official organ of the American Humanist Association, condemning astrology, or at least presenting the arguments for why astrology was not based on scientific grounds. And he put together a list of people to sign this document, 186 well-respected scientists, including 18 Nobel Prize winners, and did get it published in the Humanist, but not without a lot of flack and disgruntlement. There were a lot of people in the American Humanist Association at that time who were relativists. They basically didn't want to take a stand on anything, didn't think that they could tell whether anything was true, and weren't even certain that there is a concept of truth, something which has been a movement in philosophy for a very long time. Anyway, Kurtz did get his document published. Some of us in this room have met Paul Kurtz or know him anyway, and they will be able to attest how when Paul Kurtz wants to do something, he gets it done. But he decided that the Humanist Association was not going to be the vehicle for presenting a rational alternative to pseudoscience and religion. And so he ended up forming the organization SciCop, the Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal, and another organization which was kind of a rival to the American Humanist Association, the Center for Inquiry, to publish the magazine Free Inquiry. That was in the early 70s. The main aims of SciCop, I think, are really important to think about, because those of us who are still involved in the skeptics movement might want to keep these aims in mind as we try to do what we're trying to do. The main thing was that in the mid-70s, there were a lot of pseudoscientists of various sorts, from chiropractors to naturopaths. These people would try to cash in on the prestige of science, while at the same time saying something completely opposite to what science is about. This is really the heart of the term pseudoscience, pseudo meaning fake. Kurtz's enterprise was to try and at least let these guys stand for what they really believed in without using the cloak of science to justify their claims. One thing that Kurtz was very adamant about, and something which really struck me and probably what got me into the movement more than anything, was the idea that academics in the universities or in think tanks or people who should be in the forefront of making the case that science doesn't support these kinds of claims just weren't doing their jobs. And there's a number of reasons for that. The most cynical and negative of the reasons were basically that people don't get tenure for debunking pseudoscience. People at universities get their tenure for actually doing work in their own field, not debunking somebody else. So it was one of those things that one did as a labor of love rather than as a career advancement move. But probably more importantly was the fact that most scientists were engaged in their own research. That's what they really cared about. And the reasons why pseudoscience is pseudoscience is too trivial for them. It's the kind of thing that nobody wants to go back to what they were thinking when they were a 9-year-old, when they're doing advanced research in quantum mechanics. And so they just, never wanted to take the time to do it. And they also recognized, those people who had tried to do it at certain times, they recognized that they got a lot of hostility and sometimes career problems with trying to debunk pseudoscience. Lee and I, when we were discussing what we're going to talk about today, mentioned that the very last meeting of the BC Skeptics, some 25 years after the time I'm speaking of now, we were going to debate with a creation scientist. And we first of all had a very, very well-respected biologist from SFU who's going to be on the side of the angels on the issue for us. And later he decided not to do it because the particular guy that we got to debate the devil side of the issue was pretty... I'm trying to look for the nice word for it. Didn't know very much science. Put it that way.
He was an idiot.
Yeah, that's. I knew I could count on Lee to get the proper description. So he backed out, and we later got a very, very good person who had debated many such people in the past, Scott Goodman, to do our side of the story. So that was 25 years later, and it still is true today that a lot of academics just don't want to get involved with these people because it's hard to wash your hands afterwards after you've shaken hands with them. And another, I think, more important reason for the lack of energy amongst academics to debate the paranormal, this is something philosophically respectable, I think, is that we all know, given that we're on this side of the intellectual issues, that the onus of proof is on the person who makes the claim, not on the person who wants to debunk it. And that notion of the onus of proof is probably one of the most important central themes in philosophy, and establishing who has the onus of proof in a given issue. And the simple fact of the matter is that the onus of proof is on the person who makes the paranormal claim, not on the person who wants to debunk it. So given the fact that the pseudoscientists don't bother to do the research, don't bother to provide the evidence, instead they rely on other kinds of ways of promoting their message, it's kind of a downer for any academic to come in there and debate them. And secondly, they just say, well, that's their job to present me the evidence, and then I'll tell you what I think of it. So before any evidence comes in, there's no work for the scientists to do. And that was the common attitude in the mid-'70s. And Paul Kurtz made the case to those of us, I was a young academic at that time, and he certainly convinced me that, well, wait a minute, the taxpayers pay for my nice, cushy time to sit around and read books and think and occasionally talk to students, and so really I owe them something back. I should, try to promote the message of rationality as best I could to a wider audience. And that was Paul Kurtz's main contribution, I think, to the history of skepticism, to get academics to live up to their responsibilities to the wider public. And I'm certainly in line with that. So Kurtz got people engaged in a number of things that they hadn't been involved in before. Things like responding to paranormal claims in TV shows. You remember the gamut of In Search of and The Truth About kinds of specials that we still see on TV today. The claims that people make that quantum mechanics shows why homeopathy can work, and so on. Kurtz got people in the academic community to show why that just wasn't so. Two things that he did, I think, tell us something about why the skeptics movement took the turn that it did. Two particular events. One was in the early days of PsyCop. Kurtz gathered together first colleagues of his at Buffalo University, including one character by the name of Mario Truzzi, a sociologist. And again, Lee will have something to say that's probably more accurate than what I will say about sociologists. Sociologists are kind of the real defenders of that doctrine of relativism that I mentioned earlier, the idea that there really is no truth, and what your culture tells you to believe is the best you can have on things. Mario Truzzi was, being a sociologist, a kind of proponent of that view, although Kurtz didn't realize it at the time. And one of the first moves that PsyCop did was to found a journal, originally called the Zetetic. And Mario Truzzi was the first editor of that journal. And what he tried to do was to try to make it into kind of a forum where skeptics could debate with true believers about these issues. And that wasn't Kurtz's idea. Kurtz's idea was that there's all kinds of places where you can go to find out about homeopathy and Reiki and the like. What the journal would be a place to give the scientific view about these questions. So there was a kind of bit of a nasty fallout between Kurtz and Truzzi over that, and that was one lesson that Kurtz learned. And a second event happened, which also was probably more influential in why skepticism went the way that it did under Kurtz. Astrology was probably the biggest source of irrationality in the mid-'70s, less so today than it was then. And what Kurtz wanted to do was to focus on that issue, on that pseudoscience first. And there was a character, or a pair of characters actually, Michel and François Goncoulin, French people who were basically astrologers but didn't want to call themselves that. They had their own name for what they were doing. They called it astrobiology. And the claim was that their particular science was totally different from the kind of thing you read about in the morning paper, the astrology columns in the morning paper. Theirs was based on scientific grounds. And actually, as far back as 1955, that pair made the claim that, for example, sports champions would be more likely to be born under the sign of Mars, which is kind of a traditional astrological claim. Mars is the god of war, and of course sports is a kind of war between two teams, and so it's only natural you expect that soccer players would be more likely to be born under the Mars sign. And he did a number of studies which claimed to demonstrate that. Well, in 1976, one of the first projects of SciCop was to look into those claims and to do a replication of Gonklin's studies. Actually, SciCop was not the first to do that. A Belgian group, the Committee Para, attempted to replicate their studies in 1967 and failed. They got pure chance results for born under that sign. But the Gonklins were adamant and probably as good as Paul Kurtz at getting their message out. And the claim was still fully alive in 76, and so SciCop went to do another replication. But things turned badly at one point when a colleague of Kurtz's, I think if I remember correctly, a former student of his, a guy by the name of Dennis Rollins, who is quite a good statistician, was part of the team to do, you can imagine the immense amount of statistical work that would be involved in checking over all these sports champions and trying to decide whether they were born under the proper signs and so on. The lead statistician was a very, very prominent statistician who was at Buffalo at that time, later moved to Harvard, a guy by the name of Marvin Zellin. But Dennis Rollins was one of the sort of more peons who were doing just some of the more dog's body work in the study. He claimed to have actually found in the enormous amount of data that was gathered evidence that the Gonklins were in fact right. And in the media, and things became quite ugly. There were a number of people who were claiming that Paul Kurtz and Martin Zellin had covered up the data because they were just zealots who wanted to prove their side of the question no matter what. And it was a kind of an embarrassment for this new organization that started at the time. Well, the net result of those two incidents with Trutzy and Rollins was that Kurtz decided that the organization needed to be very careful in who would speak for the organization and who would be in a position to talk to the media. And so from that point on, the SciCop organization was very much top-down. The deal was it was basically Paul Kurtz. There was an executive council, which some of you remember my brother Barry was actually on the executive council at some later point, not at the very beginning, but later on. There was a group of 7 or 8 people on that council who were the only people who could speak for SciCop itself. Everybody else, there were 250 or 300 scientific and technical consultants, but they weren't to speak on behalf of the organization itself. The idea was going to be that SciCop would be the organization that would disseminate the information from scientific studies and put the message out, and in fact maybe commission people or encourage them to do scientific studies of paranormal claims. But SciCop itself wasn't going to be involved after this, the Gonklins. And so that was, in fact, the major impetus of the journal Skeptical Inquirer, was to publish the results of studies done by other people. And Kurtz made a special effort to encourage academics to do the studies and to talk about their studies and go to the media about them and to publish them in the Skeptical Inquirer. But SciCop itself didn't take a position on those things. And that was the policy of SciCop all the time, that it existed until it turned into, until it shortened its name from SciCop to Sci, the Committee for Scientific Inquiry, in about 10 or 12 years ago. Well, the BC Skeptics started out in the mid-'80s when SciCop got the idea that it would be a good thing if there were sort of local groups in other countries and spread out as much as possible. And at that time, there was an Australian guy who was the head of an organization of skeptics in Australia, Mark Plummer, who came to Buffalo, to the Mecca of skepticism, where Paul Kurtz was. And Lee will remember Mark. He was a very energetic guy and very, very amusing and a really good motivator.
Amateur magician.
And a good amateur musician, yeah. So what actually happened was he sent to Barry and me a list of subscribers to the Skeptical Inquirer. And that's what I was speaking about earlier, the very first meeting of what became the BC Skeptics, held at SFU in 1986. And that was the beginnings of our organization. Well, another part of the way Kurtz had things organized was that each of these local groups would be ones that shared the aim of SciCop, the aim of doing original research to back up the claims that we made and making the claims in the media to try and promote rationality. But the organization was not officially a part of SciCop. It was an independent organization which had no official connection to SciCop. So when we started, we were our own organization. We ended up following a lot of the principles of SciCop. Basically, there were 4 or 5 of us that became the executive of the BC Skeptics. Lee and me and Bill. Were you actually? You left by that point? You're on your way to leaving.
I left 6 months later.
Okay, yeah. Anyway, we basically spoke for the organization as in the same model as SciCop. We also had another thing which we had that was similar to the parent organization, but for very different reasons. Paul Kurtz, in founding the SciCop organization, also founded the other organization, the CFI, the Center for Inquiry, to look at religious claims. And he kept a strict sort of division at the beginning between those two organizations, in part because there was a very rich donor who was sending Kurtz a fair bit of money for SciCop at the time, who was very religious. He was a fundamentalist Christian. And the reason he supported SciCop is that SciCop was debunking ghosts and all of those sorts of things, and his particular brand of fundamentalist Christianity also didn't believe in that. But on the other hand, this guy probably wouldn't have been so loose with the purse strings if he saw Kurtz debunking religion in general. This guy was giving money to SciCop, but he didn't have to think he was giving any money to CFI. So that was one large reason for originally keeping these two organizations separate. We followed the same path in the BC Skeptics, but for very different and I think much better reasons. The reason was that the BC Humanists Association was already up and going and an important organization way before the Skeptics. Some 5-6 years, I think, the organization had been going at that point. And an opportunity to thank you guys again. You gave us some seed money to start us off with the BC Skeptics. And so, of course, our group decided, well, all right, we'll concentrate on the paranormal and the other kinds of things, because the humanists were already doing a good job on the religion stuff. And so we had that division, which worked in some respects, but as I mentioned before, many of you came to our meetings, and we came to some of yours in those days too. We were, in many ways, very close, but we were separate organizations. Let me just give you one more thing, which I think is really kind of important before I turn things over to Lee. I think basically there are 3 things that a movement like the BC Humanists or the CFI, which is taken over for the BC Skeptics, or the CSI or any larger organization might want to be involved in. Two of them I've mentioned. They were sort of part of the very foundations of psychop. The research into paranormal or religious claims and the dissemination of information about the results of those researches. There's a third thing, I think, which groups like us can make an important contribution to, and that's the kind of, shall I use the Christian term without offending anybody, the sort of fellowship that comes from the meetings that you're having now and the Skeptics in the Pub that CFI runs and so on. A chance for people to, I want to be careful in the way I phrase this, not for people to go deal with like-minded people, because I was talking to Frank before we started today. I think one of the most important things you can ever do is to find somebody that you disagree with and have it out with them. The best way for you to get your own thoughts in order is to present them to somebody else who disagrees with you, and it's going to keep you on your toes. But it's not so much that you want to have a community of people who think the same way you do and agree with you. Yeah, that astrology is real bullshit, isn't it? But instead you want people who sort of approach their thinking in the same way. That is, that you are willing to suspend judgment on something until you get some evidence. That you're not willing to let your emotions decide for you what you're going to believe. That you're prepared to change your mind when you gather evidence that you didn't have before. And this is something that's really, really difficult. It's a kind of balancing act that some of us are better at than others, but nobody's perfect at it. But on the one hand, you want to make sure that you're not pig-headed and totally without any sense of that you might be wrong about something. You want to avoid that. But on the other hand, you don't want to be entirely wishy-washy and relativistic or say, well, geez, I don't know. Who knows? Could be. Because, you see, if you do want to have an argument with somebody, you've got to start with a position that people can agree or disagree with before you can get anywhere. And so you need to get that attitude, which is really the heart of skepticism, of being able to say, well, all right, the evidence that's come down so far makes me say, this is how it is. Okay? And I'm going to stick to it. I'm not going to just give it up because you don't like what I'm saying and I don't want to offend you. I'm not going to give it up because it makes me feel uncomfortable to have to believe that I'm going to be dead and there's not going to be anything after that. I'll change my mind if the evidence comes down another way. But until then, I've got this position which I will do my best to bring out there. And, of course, one of the things that has kept me in touch with the humanists and the skeptics for 30-some-odd years is that skeptics and humanists intuitively understand the importance of that willingness to argue, willingness to entertain evidence before coming up with their beliefs. And as I say, one of the great advantages of these groups is that it gives you a chance to get together with people who are like that. So that is something which I think I'd like you to keep in mind as I pass things over to Lee. What has happened in the local scene is that what started out being more of the emphasis on research and examination of paranormal claims and the dissemination of information through the media has now become more of the social aspect of it. And I'll make you an offer. And I'm sure Lee is behind this too. Lee and I have had a fair bit of experience over the years, not only shooting our mouths off and debunking claims, but trying to actually do some research to determine whether there's anything there or not. If I can tout my own horn a little bit, I've done research into graphology, therapeutic touch, Sai Baba, and I'm quite happy now in my retirement, now that I got more time on my hands, to engage with anybody who wants to do some investigation of these things. And I think it would be kind of fun if we got some more of that going again, along with the other things that we do. So there's my offer to you, if ever you want to get involved in some ghost busting or a psychological experiment of some sort to test a claim. Let's get something going. Just one last point. part of this change from the sort of public media debunking, why we're doing less of that now, is a change in people's worldview, which I'm kind of concerned about. In one way, I'm kind of happy. Another way, I'm kind of concerned. Skepticism has probably become more acceptable since Paul Kurtz got things going in 1976, 40 years ago. But not entirely in a positive way. Not that it's entirely understood in the way that I was describing it a moment ago as the refusal to accept a claim until you get evidence for it, and if you don't get evidence to say so. Skepticism has come to mean for a lot of people a kind of general distrust of expertise, of people who might be in a position to know something. We saw last week that in a big way in the United States. Trump was elected precisely because he knew nothing. And that was counted as a good thing. And there is a tendency, which is often called skepticism, and I would stop calling myself a skeptic if I had to be branded with those people. There's this tendency to say, well, everybody's full of bullshit, and you can't trust anybody, and the more letters you got behind your name, the less you probably know. It's one of those people who've got some common sense out there in the world who know anything. And I think that's a very dangerous kind of thing, and I sure hope that it doesn't keep to the name skepticism. And what's disturbing me is that this trend is on the rise, and there's sort of less call now for people who might be in a position to know about the paranormal or religion, people who've actually studied about it, thought about it, and gathered evidence and found that there wasn't any. There's less reason for those people to be asked for their opinions now than there used to be. And so that's in part the reason why I think the skeptics movement locally has not got the profile in the media that it used to have. We used to be asked, or sort of on the, if I could put it this way, we were on the Rolodexes of every reporter in town, and whenever something in the paranormal came up, they would come to us. Now we're not on the address book on the computers of those people as much as we used to be. Why? I think in part because authorities aren't given the credit that they used to get, and I think that's kind of a bad thing. And I have no idea how to turn that around. And I couldn't possibly have defeated Donald Trump. But any thoughts you have about that, I think, are important to try and put forth and try to do something about. So I'll stop at this point. Lee is going to tell us some more about some of the war stories from our own local group, because he's been the newsletter editor and been involved since day one in the movement. So,
great. I'm told I have a pretty loud voice, so can everybody hear me all right? For an occasion such as this, I really want to sing the praises of Dale Beyerstein and his brother, perhaps more than anything. Barry Beyerstein died, literally dropped dead at work, quite surprisingly, in 2008.
Yeah.
And he marched a huge array of really, really interesting people through the city. James Randi, Jerry Andrews, a magician's magician, Ray Hyman, who, among other things, got paid by the U.S. government to look into the military applications of remote viewing, to take down Russian rockets and stuff like that without getting out of your easy chair, which is weird, but there you go. I recall Glenn Hardy, who was the past president of the BC Humanists, and he was at a lot of our meetings, as I recall, and a delightful fellow. Is he still with us?
Yeah,
okay, great. Glad to hear it. I hate asking questions like that. Oh, okay, great. Well, I was looking forward to seeing him, but and I have a great deal of admiration for the humanists. My atheist days started listening to George Carlin albums in the 1970s, because that's the only time and place where you could hear anything like that at all. They canceled Smothers Brothers on television because they cracked a joke about Moses, and it was all over. Speaking of jokes, two dyslexics walk into a bra. A woman walks into a bra, and the bartender says, "What do you have?" She says, "I'll have a double entendre." So he gives it to her. Sorry. You guys have a much more difficult problem than the BC Skeptics did to a large extent. If you recall the Black Knight from the Holy Grail, every time you lopped off an arm or a leg or something like that, you just go, "'Tis but a scratch," and keep coming at you. And it seemed like no matter how much you pounded them down into a bloody little pulp, they just kept on coming back no matter what. And of course, you could never point to any evidence one place or another and say, "See, that proves me right and you wrong," or vice versa. BC Skeptics, on the other hand, stuck to empirical stuff where we could do that. So I sort of see it as the easy road, and you guys took the tougher path. When we got started, I wrote a letter from an article I read in the Scientific American, I think in 1985, about skeptics groups, and I was pretty skeptical. If anybody likes this T-shirt, by the way, just Google the phrase. It's a wonderful website. Bill's wearing another T-shirt from the same site of atheist and anti-religious kind of stuff, all available for a few beans. I wrote that letter to Barry Beyerstein, and that within a few months we got together for the first meeting of the BC Skeptics. We weren't the BC Skeptics at the time. In fact, that was a big discussion. One of the things that we discussed in our first meeting was, what do we call the newsletter? And we kicked that around for about 5 minutes until Barry pulled out the title from his back pocket, which I think he'd been carrying around for like 20 years or something like that, which is, I think we should call it the Rational Inquirer. And everybody went, "Perfect!" And that's where it went. The newsletter, I think, tried to reflect the Skeptical Inquirer, and largely because of Barry and Dale and other academics whom I got to meet through my association, we published some pretty good stuff, and a lot of it got a lot of play around the world, and I was really happy about that. But the first day I was in, I was skeptical. There's a bunch of people I'd never met before. I thought they were all just going to be a bunch of hoity-toity academics, perhaps, a group that I associate myself with, but nevertheless, I was still skeptical. And Barry Beyerstein introduced himself, and he said, "I'm a psychologist." And you might recall the McMartin preschool incident in those days, right? This is very big in my head, you know, and I'm sure my face probably went something like this. What am I doing here? And he said, no, you don't understand. I'm an experimental psychologist. You know, we torture rats for a living, and, you know, test response times from people when we provide certain types of stimulus and that sort of thing. And I said, well, that's okay. And time marched forward. To skip a long way forward, I told the exact same story at the funeral of Barry Beyerstein at the Diamond Club at SFU. And afterwards, Dale came and thanked me for what I'd said. And I said, well, I didn't really say anything. He says, yeah, you did. Because you pissed off half the people in the room. This is why, because half of them are clinical psychologists. And oh, right, I hadn't thought of that. And that's not the first time in my life where I've said a few things to people which I didn't think about before I said them. The other time that's relevant here was when we skipped to the very end of the BC Skeptics and the meeting that Dale was talking about with Richard Peachy, a part-time science teacher out of Abbotsford. And Barry had spent several months, and I have followed the email trail, of trying to negotiate a discussion about intelligent design, because that was hot and big in the news at the time. And we had a guy named Ron Eisenberg at this meeting. Richard Peachy was there, I was there, and Barry was there. And it was the first time we were all in the same room at the same time, and Peachy sat down next to me, and I wasted no time. I said, so, what are you? Creationist, fundamentalist, wackadoodle ID guy? Pick one. And we all expected him to say, well, I'm here to talk about intelligent design. He said, nope, I'm a straight-up creationist. 6,000 years old, end of story. And Ron Eisenberg said, done and dusted, I'm out, because he's dealt with these people before, didn't want anything to do with it. And both Barry and I looked at each other and said, what the hell have we been talking about for the last several months? Because we wanted to talk about ID, not creationism. But the wheels had been rolling, and the date was set, and the people involved were booked to come, and we had our meeting. And it was the last of 3 times at least I can think of where the BC Skeptics got abused. For those of you who might have been there, the meeting was packed. We had publicized it more than most. There were a lot of skeptics there. There was a guy named Scott Goodman, who was a science teacher and a very good creationist argumenter, shall we say, and Richard Peachy himself, and a truckload, and I mean literally a truckload of people from Abbotsford with all kinds of brochures and stuff like that telling you why you were wrong and they were right and you're going to burn in hell and so on. From a skeptic's perspective, if you were listening to the arguments, the case was pretty airtight on our side, but needless to say, we convinced nobody. Dale mentioned our first big fight, which is graphology. Graphology is handwriting analysis. These are people who will tell you whether you're a potential pedophile based on how you dot your I's and cross your T's. And if you go back to the 1970s, most ads, if you were looking for a job, you looked in the paper and you'd look for a want ad in the Vancouver Sun or something, and most of them, plus 50% anyways, would say, please submit a handwritten covering letter along with your resume. They wouldn't tell you why, but the reason is because they were handing them off to graphologists who were telling them whether they're going to be good hires or bad hires or whatever. And this guy basically killed that industry in British Columbia.
For a while.
He taught BC Hydro, Macmillan Bloedel, a bunch of other
all
major players.
And school boards.
Except Chilliwack, come on, nobody can touch them. They're thick as bricks out there. But everybody else was on board, and they stopped using graphology as a mechanism. Now, you could argue that technology was going to kill it anyways, because how do you submit a handwritten covering letter in an email, which is the only way things go out today? I know it could be done, but it would be a pretty weird thing to ask for. But as a consequence of that, we lined up a woman named Linda Pitney. And Linda Pitney was a graphologist out of Toronto, and she came to Vancouver, and she challenged the BC Skeptics, and the BC Skeptics challenged her back, and we all agreed that we'd have a big test, and she yacked it up in all the papers and got interviewed and probably got a lot of clients, and we hammered out a protocol, and both agreed to it, and then she bugged off back to Toronto. We never heard from her again. The second meeting that stands out in my mind was with Qigong. We had a Qigong master in, and this one was also packed to the gills, SRO as they say. And we had arranged a test for him. This guy swore up and down that he could beam Qi into water. So in other words, he just do that, and he said that we could take the water away and we could bring it back, and he would point to the glass that he had done that to and not the other ones. And we said, fine, we can do that, and that's a pretty damn easy experiment to set up. So he agreed to do that. All the people piled in. The meeting got started, and he said, I've had a long day at Qi. I've just been Qiing since the morning, Qiing all afternoon, and I'm all Qi'd out. But if you want to find out what wonderful things I can do to make you more healthy, I'll be glad to answer any questions. And meanwhile, and he went up to the whiteboard, and for reasons that to this day I still do not understand, he wrote down F equals GMM over R squared. Newton's formula for gravity. What the hell that's got to do with Qi, I have no idea. But that's what he did. And when it finally came to questions, half the audience's arms went up like that, and the other half went up like that. This is the skeptical side, this is the not-so-skeptical side. Skeptical side said, you're full of crap, and he didn't really say anything. Everybody on the other side said, I got this pain in my side. What do you think I should do? And they were there essentially for free medical advice. Another amusing story, Paul Kurtz hung his hat in Buffalo, New York. And when he came to Vancouver, he was very impressed by the city. Of course, visually it's very impressive. We were driving in from Pelican Bay in Granville Island to the Beyerstein residence in Port Moody. And we had just started our journey when he said, so, I'm just curious, drive me through the crappiest part of town. And we were going through Pigeon Park, and I said, here it is, rock bottom. He said, wow, this is pretty good, no burning cars or anything. And I'm like, oh, right, yeah, Buffalo, I forgot. What else? Did we have another antagonist who screwed us around? I'm trying to think.
Yeah, we had lots of them.
Is there time for some questions from the audience?
Yeah, sure, why not? There you
You
go.
want to
Some
take
questions.
that mic? I'll pass this mic around.
About truth, isn't it an absolute certainty that the Earth goes around the Sun and that the periodic table is pretty solid? Does anybody question those two truths?
Unfortunately, you'd think that that was what's called a reductio ad absurdum amongst philosophers. That you make a point that makes other people look so stupid that they've got to back down. But there are people who question even the truths of those kinds of things, and I'm embarrassed to admit that there are some philosophers who do that. But again, they're sort of centered mainly in sociology departments. They go by various names. Social construction of reality, postmodernism, and so on. And their basic line just is that truths of the sort that Frank mentioned, ones at the basis of science and what serve as the foundation of everything else that we claim to know, and would really be a bad thing if they turned out not to be. So they can be questioned too, because what they are really are simply a function of those people who happen to be in power and who control everything, the scientists and the people like those. They ram the stuff down the rest of our throats because they own the media and they belong to the Jews. They own the sources of power.
Dishonest.
And they just put this view ahead of us. And on the other hand, the native spiritualists and the feminist ecologists and these other people just don't get a chance to put their line out. So, the only reason you believe in the periodic table is that you got pushed into it by people who just rammed it down your throat. And you have no reason to believe it at all.
It's certainly true that everything I think I know I learned from other people, but science is well founded by all the experts in each particular subject.
Oh, yeah.
It's testable.
Yeah.
I think everybody's probably had this experience in this room. I'm guessing that you walk into a party and somebody said, "Oh, I just popped this pill and it cured me of the cold," and you find out it's homeopathy, and you try to explain it, and you realize that before you can even start to explain to that person, you've got to establish an entire layer of epistemology about which they have never spent 2 minutes in their lives even thinking about. And that's one of the hugely refreshing things about getting into groups like this, is that base work is already there and you don't have to start over again every time you talk about it. And to go to your remark, I would suggest that the people who are buying into homeopathy are saying, screw the periodic table. What the hell do they know? Personal experience trumps science, and that's the way most people feel.
Well, I guess this is a good time to plug the Vancouver Skeptics, which has, in a way, taken over some of the things that the BC Skeptics were doing. The first skeptic event I went to was the Langara creationist evolution debate.
All right. Our swan song, cool.
Yeah. And I did go to one SFU BC Skeptics talk a month before your brother passed away. So there's a bit of a transition there. I started the Vancouver Skeptics in the Pub Facebook group, and that has been organizing monthly events. Started with one downtown at the Railway Club every month, and we were up to as many as 7 or 8. Now there's about 6 monthly events downtown, Kitsilano, North Van, New West, and a couple out in Surrey Langley. We also promote the Café Scientifique talks, where there's a local scientist talking about their research. And as you mentioned, it is more of a social organization, social event, more than testing claims. Occasionally we'll have presentations. We also organized a Skeptic Camp, free one-day conference type events almost every year since 2008. So if you're interested in finding out more about those, if you Google Vancouver Skeptics, go to vancouverskeptics.org. There's an event calendar on there, and you can find out, just drop by any of our events. It's not a membership organization, it's just free to attend, hang out with like-minded people, although we do find enough to disagree about, and just have a good time meeting people who are also science enthusiasts interested in skepticism. And we tend to be people who are listening to the same skeptical podcast, like a Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, reading the same skeptical blogs, so keeping up with those kind of current events.
For about 3.5 years, you and I were on Co-op Radio together, doing a Skeptics radio show, which I guess would be the official last act of the BC Skeptics, you might say. Oddly enough, we It was a great show. We had a lot of fun doing it, but in the end, we all marched out together over, believe it or not, vaccinations as an issue. The management of the radio station was prepared to bend over backwards to make sure that we were fair and balanced when there is no call for fair and balance in this particular argument. And our biology guy said, I ain't got time for this, and we all said, well, if you're going, we're going.
So by the way, following what Fred said, we used to have something called a podcast made in Canada called Skeptically Speaking. Now it's called Science for the People. I also highly recommend it. You mentioned that humanists and skeptics instinctively know to look for evidence. But I think that everybody knows that. What happens is, how do we know what is evidence? And my question is, don't you think that it will be a good objective for all of our different organizations in this field to try to push for teaching the scientific method in high school? It should be, nobody should leave high school without understanding what counts as evidence.
There are slight movements in that direction. Things are getting better in the teaching of science in the public schools. But you're right, there's still a lot more to be done. And if people had that basic understanding, they wouldn't be wasting a lot of time on paranormal claims. Get them when you're young.
Just one quick point on the astrology area. If you go look on the internet, it's unfortunately bad news. Belief in astrology was declining until 2004. Most of the polls now show it's actually starting to increase again, I believe. The interesting thing is that unfortunately there's a big belief among millennials, if you can believe. And women believe astrology more than men, so if there's anything we can claim or whatever. The question I've got to you is that, given just what happened in the U.S. in the election of Donald Trump, do scientists not have more of a responsibility to speak out? It's not enough to do research and put out these great papers and run these models. If they don't speak out, this is what's going to happen to us. You know who Donald Trump is appointing to oversee climate change? Myron Ebell. He worked for the American Enterprise Institute that's supported by the coal industry and Exxon. And this is the largest scientific country in the world. If climate change is so important, they have got to get off their stools at the university. They've got to start yelling and screaming and calling these people the idiots they are.
No, I can't agree with you more. And as I say, that was the main contribution that Paul Kurtz made at the foundation of PsyCop and the New Skeptics movement, to get academics to be more willing to just converse with the general public over the things that they had expertise in. Unfortunately, what those of us who've been around for a long time have discovered is that it's hard work and not a career booster. It can sometimes be very detrimental. And we're talking about my brother earlier. He faced fairly severe onslaught against his reputation at SFU because of his
dream healer. Right?
Yeah. Well, the one goes back a long ways. There was a person who actually taught my brother when SFU first started. My brother was one of the original undergraduate students there in '65. This guy was a great person to drink beer with in the pub. And so he became friends with my brother. And later, when my brother became a faculty member, if I can tell the story in a catty version, he was in a department that got eliminated. And so basically, that was the chance for the university to get rid of him. And he hadn't published a thing since he came to SFU in '65. This is about 1990 by this time. Hadn't really done anything except sit in the bar. But he was a grand manipulator at university politics. And you remember Henry Kissinger's remark about academia, the reason why the academic politics is so dirty is that the stakes are so low. Well, this guy played those games with real skill. And he managed to get himself his own department. Basically, nobody else wanted to work with him. And what his department was going to be, he was going to be parapsychology. And so Barry was actually put in charge of a committee to evaluate whether this would be a viable academic thing or not. And he got a bunch of other people involved in it, namely me. I was at Malsbina College at that time, and a few other people across the province. And we wrote letters to the relevant dean talking about how it would be a real embarrassment for SFU if this guy were allowed to preach that nonsense. And the guy, to put a long story short, had to find something else that he could claim to be his own department in. But he had it out for Barry ever since. And so later on, he got in league with Doug Todd, who is still writing in the Vancouver Sun, the religion editor, who's never met a flake that he didn't want to tout. And these two guys went after Barry and claimed that he graded his students on the basis of whether they believed in what he said or not. Whether they towed company line. And my brother actually had a little bit of difficulty with that. And that's not unheard of in academia. And that is a part of the reason why academics are somewhat reluctant to speak on these matters.
By the way, Myron Ebell doesn't call himself a climate change denier. He's a climate change skeptic.
Yes.
Taken the scientific terminology of skeptic and making it look like he's a skeptic.
Yeah, that's a really disturbing trend. I think everybody wants to call themselves a skeptic. It's got some sort of positive cachet, but that's who a lot of the skeptics are, and they give us a bad name.
My question is, you mentioned about chiropractic and naturopathy. The trend seems to be that the acceptance of it is increasing. Is this because the placebo effect is so great that they spend less money if people go to osteopaths and reflexologists and naturopaths and chiropractors, and then they think psychologically they feel better and therefore saves money? Do the insurance company really believe these things work?
Wasn't it just about 4 or 5 years ago that naturopaths were able to prescribe certain classes of drugs?
Yeah, psychotropic drugs. Yeah. The money angle, I think, is a big part of it, saving money by these guys charge less per hour than per visit. And another thing is, and I just noticed this myself yesterday. I think I told you that I'm an escapee from VGH at the moment. They let me out on a day pass to come here. On my ward, there's a rack of pamphlets. One of them is one on complementary medicine for cancer. And I was looking at it, and I was trying to. I had no involvement in the design of the thing, but I was trying to figure what's the political subtext behind this thing, because it actually does say that none of these things work for curing cancer, but on the other hand, it might do you some good for pain and other kinds of things. And it's obviously the kind of document that went through a committee consisting of probably some genuine scientific medical people and some flakes. One just reminded me of a struggle that's been going on in medicine for a long time. There's a fair number of practitioners trained in medical schools now who get this line that you got to know about alternative and complementary medicine. If for no other reason than your patients are going to want to use it, you got to take into account the fact that they're taking these medications and make sure that they don't have bad side effects as a result of it. But this is also part of a thin edge of the wedge, elephant snoot in the trough and under the tent kind of phenomenon, where there's quite a few people who are real believers in this stuff, who are using those arguments to get the stuff into mainstream medicine. The worst case is something that I was involved in at one point, therapeutic touch in the nursing schools. Therapeutic touch, if I could be very quick about it, is neither therapeutic nor touch. It's a way of manipulating the energy fields around your body to if they're in line, then you're healthy. If they're out of line, then you're sick.
You can say it's chi.
Yeah. So therapeutic touch has taken over nursing schools. Now you wonder why nurses go to school for 4 years now rather than the old 3. It's because that 4th year largely consists of a lot of feminist, I don't want to say indoctrination, a lot of feminist courses, and therapeutic touch and a few other things like that. And I think
let's not get involved in feminism.
No, let's but certainly I'll stand by what I said on therapeutic touch. There are sort of a lot of inroads into nursing and medicine, a lot of clear quackery.
Could we move on here?
Just a note with Paul Kurtz. I got grilled by him when I became president of the Manitoba Skeptics, and part of the reason why they disassociated the local groups from PsyCop was because they had a number of situations where groups had formed, and then they went along most of the way along with the skeptical stance, but they said, oh, this one over here is real. And just a couple of notes. I think three of the most famous moments in skeptical history were Randy's $1 Million Challenge, which you guys didn't mention. And you have to, Uri Geller, and the challenge
that was a good one.
And Pop on Johnny Carson. Okay, those I think are three of the most famous moments in skeptical history.
They're worth mentioning.
If you've never seen Peter Popov, you can find it on YouTube. Peter Popov and Carson, I think, or Randy will pop it right up. It's a fabulous debunk. I don't want to give it away because it's too good for words.
Yeah.
Thank you for all the work you've done over the years in the presentation today. I had another question concerning the bifurcation that you mentioned earlier on about the going after the woo-woo science and then going after the religion, which is what we do here. I think there's a third emerging area that we've come across a lot. It's the alt-right people. It's the conspiracy people. I think this is emerging with Donald Trump being elected. I think it's really dangerous. You can lump in a whole bunch of things. And I wanted to know if you encountered that. What do you suggest about it?
Yeah, I've encountered a few 9/11 conspiracy people. The first thing to say is the one thing that I mentioned earlier is that the onus of proof lies on the people founding the claim. But something else you mentioned, which is the scary part of it, that usually those conspiracy-minded people are driven by things extra rational. You mentioned the hatred and the fear and the mistrust of certain people. That's a way harder thing to deal with rationally or with the methods that we're used to dealing with.
One of the reasons I don't get terribly involved in social media is because it's the platform for all of these people with their weird ideas. I don't have the time, the energy, or the interest to listen to all that garbage.
I like what Christopher Hitchens had to say on that, which is that which can be proposed without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. When people talk about conspiracy theories, you either go down the rabbit hole or you just got to back up. And I usually say, well, there are people who say we never went to the moon, and there are other people that say we never left the moon. I say put them in a room and let them duke it out.
We have a couple of more questions here.
Do you have an outreach program for people who are interested in learning component, learning critical thinking skills?
It's one of the things that seems to have kind of disappeared. The phoenix that rose from the ashes of the BC Skeptics is a little more socially oriented, as you pointed out, but the academic side seems to have disappeared a little bit, and I don't know how to revive it.
Well, our radio show that we mentioned earlier was an attempt to start that, but one possibility would be a continuing ed course at one of the institutions around here on critical thinking and basic scientific reasoning. I'm game to get in that. As I say, I'm retired now, and so I've got some time on my hands, and I'd be happy to work with anybody who wants to do anything about that. But you're right. I mean, it would be really a good thing if we could get some of that going.
I do think a night course or whatever in critical thinking is an excellent idea, and I'm sure that we as a group would probably get behind something like that.
I tried it once with the North Shore continuing education, lined up the course, did a little work, graded the syllabus. One person showed up.
Really?
It took us about 10 minutes to agree. We're all skeptical, and then we went home.
There are free online courses that thousands of people can take at the same time.
Yeah, unfortunately the internet is, I don't have to tell you, it's a double-edged sword, right? For every mountain of good information, there's a bigger one of bullshit.
Okay, well, thank you all for coming. It was a great meeting. I'm very pleased to hear more about skeptics, because I didn't know very much about your origins, etc. So I appreciate it, and I'm sure we all did. Thank you very much.